Well, as we see a bit of a lull to start the week in the center of the country when it comes to rain showers, we still have plenty to talk about. How are the levels on the river system doing? What's South America look like? There's a lot to take into account here. And joining us now, Eric Snodgrass with Nutrient Ag Solutions to talk about just that. And Eric, good to catch up with you again this week. And let's start with the river levels. What's going on with the Mississippi, but also what's going on in the Panama Canal, too. I think these are two very important key stories that we need to be paying attention to right now.
Yeah, and they've been slowly evolving all summer now into fall, and so what's going on is this: we're just thinking about Western Hemisphere, you know, cargo vessels, right? Anything that moves on the ocean or on these rivers will be impacted by these two specific regions. So, despite rains last week that stretched from Wyoming all the way to New Jersey, delivering some very heavy rain to parts of the central and western Corn Belt, and then eventually over the Great Lakes and then into New England, the problem was is that the soil moisture deficits on the headwaters of the Mississippi were such that all that water got soaked in and doesn't make it into the river as fast as it would had that soil been saturated. Now remember, during all of that wet weather we saw across the Corn Belt last week, it did not get into the South. It did not get into, let's call it Southern Illinois to almost New Orleans. Now, New Orleans got rain last week, but it was just north of there. There was nothing. So Mississippi, Arkansas, Kansas, Oklahoma, Western Tennessee, Kentucky, Missouri, nothing. So what happens is we're looking at that little stretch where after the Missouri and the Ohio come together, and we see that there in Memphis, the river levels this morning here on Monday were minus 11.7 feet, which would be, again, another record for that. So that was lower than it was last year, 1288. I mean, we're going back into these crazy years of really low levels. And despite predictions of wetter conditions, they are first, the wetter conditions, which have happened, just not on that river, that part of the river, have gone to reviving the local water, not the broader Mississippi basin. So we're going to compound that with another factor, and that is over the last 3 months, we've watched a drought develop, from Mexico to Panama. That's the entirety of Central America. And especially down into Panama, the problems are that the lake in between the two big parts of the canal is very, very low. So you don't have the water to kind of balance out the other side of the lock dam system. So the issue here is that for months now, we've watched traffic back up. And what's going on now is that because of the cost, traffic is kind of avoiding the Panama Canal. And I was
Mm.
talking to my good friend Arlen Suderman about this last week, and he's just stressing, like, look, the vessels that carry ag cargo are favoring different routes because of the fact they can't get through there. It's so expensive to try to wait to get through there. Now, in Panama, October is supposed to be the wettest month. They can typically get 15 to 17 inches of rainfall during this time period. And here we are looking at much, much lower than normal rainfall up until this point in the month. And can we get that much more at the end to really revive it? Because once we get into the front half of November, they start their new dry season, which means we'll be talking about the Panama Canal issues all the way till next summer when it's supposed to
Mhm.
get wet again. So, yeah, that's really affecting the Western Hemisphere and the way we ship goods around the world. So, top story
Mhm.
there.
Definitely. One note too on the Mississippi River in the US I wanted to ask you about with the low levels. I had heard talk that there's some salt water coming upriver in Louisiana that could, have wide-ranging effects. Is that
Yeah.
something you're watching as well?
It is. So what ends up happening is without the stronger flow, and the lower levels, okay, the water is going to balance out its own tables. So you end up
Yeah,
getting this saltwater inundation. It certainly affects some of the low marshy lands first, and then it gets into the river and starts to push its way farther to north. So this affects a lot of the ecology of the area. I can't tell you that I fully understand how they use the river down there for other water uses, but I'm sure
sure.
it's going to affect that as well. Yeah, we need a big system to come through and flush the whole thing out. And unfortunately, if that happens, that disrupts everything else with harvest. So it's kind of like we talked about the last couple of weeks. We want to be careful what we wish for on the Mississippi Basin right now.
Well, let's talk about that. Are we gonna see a bigger system or a couple of systems work through this week? What's the, forecast outlook for you as you take a look at the week ahead?
Yeah, the week ahead's not looking very good in terms of moisture. We have the wrong direction of the flow. It's coming from the northwest. So Imagine just jumping over the Western United States, coming out of Canada, diving into the East. So what that does is that produces much more what we call upper level convergence, which is a dry signal. And so there is a system, there's one that's coming out of Montana tomorrow. It's going to be really windy in Montana, like 50 to 80-mile-an-hour winds at times. And that's going to dip into the northern plains, go to the Great Lakes, and head up east to produce a big system late next week, or excuse me, late this week, like Saturday, Sunday in New England. But in between where we are, it's going to be drier. So what we're waiting on is a flip. We're waiting for a change, and it's being promoted by several different subseasonal factors. Probably the biggest of which is in the Indian Ocean, believe it or not. And we expect by the time we're talking next Monday that I'll be talking about a pretty sizable pattern shift, which means cold weather finally coming into the west, warm weather, moisture laden air coming into the midsection of the country, and we're going to watch that hopefully build into a pretty sizable system. Which means this, Jesse: if I was a Midwest farmer right now and I had the manpower and the time, there's going to be a big open window for 6 or 7 days, and even if a little bit of light rain comes in, especially with that midweek system that kind of sneaks in from the northwest,
Mhm.
it's not going to chase you out of the fields for 3 days. So I would just say, go after it if you can, because if this pattern does do what we think it's going to do, I don't think November is going to look like October. So anything that's late is going to be fighting against probably more frequent systems rolling across the country, and that tightens everything up.
Well, I think it's safe to say we're pretty close to halfway done here with harvest across the country. So, to your point, if you got the open window to try and get this thing closer to the finish line, go ahead and use it here this week. Eric, South American weather. I know a lot of people are keeping an eye on Brazil. We're in the wet season down there now,
Yeah.
technically. What are you seeing as far as a forecast here for Brazil and Argentina as we look at the back half of the month of October?
Yeah. So the only place that I can get planting updates from is Mato Grosso. They publish it for free. And so I looked at that, and what are we? We're ahead of the 5-year pace by about 7%. We're behind last year's pace by about 6%. We're somewhere in the middle. And that's because in central Brazil over to Mato Grosso, they've had decent rains. Problem is that we started watching late last week the drier trend show up in the forecast, and there's good reason for it. And so now we're looking at another 7 days of not much rain in that area, which I think is going to slow the pace down a little bit. I don't think it's going to slow it down where it's going to shock the markets, but it's going to slow it down a little bit. And drier, hotter weather is going to come in, which means we're probably going to see some more replant north. Just with poor germination. Meanwhile, it's flooding in southern Brazil, but I think the most important trend, in addition to that little drier outlook for that part of Brazil, is that we're seeing the models trying to put better rains into Argentina. It's not drought curing, not even close. But I mean, Cordoba hasn't yet measured rainfall during spring. So here
Mm.
we are needing anything to come in, and it looks as though we might be getting our first chances of decent moisture into that area. So yeah, we're going to be watching that just to kind of stay on this international bend here. Australia's going over hotter, drier. We're seeing wet conditions across Europe. We're getting all the way to Ukraine and the Russian wheat belt. And overall, I think that we're still waiting to see one big factor for our winter, which is, I believe it or not, we have to care a lot about Siberia. Siberian snowpack. It's interesting, but Siberian snowpack in October and early November helps determine how these subseasonal factors in the North Atlantic and North Pacific affect our weather. So if anybody thinks that they know what winter is going to look like just yet, they might say, "Oh, it's all El Nino." Like, hang on. El Nino has yet to really take the reins of this pattern, and who knows if it really fully will. It has been over predicted for months on its strength. I think that's going to be something we're going to have to keep talking about as time goes forward.
It's interesting how all those different factors around the world have an impact around the world, Eric. It's interesting to think about that.
It is, and it's just like the markets, right? You're trying to figure out
Mhm.
which one is going to control the narrative, and a lot of times the things you think that are going to control the narrative don't, and that's ultimately why we are in a business that has so much risk in it, right? And why we talk all the time, because there's a new story tomorrow as the whole system evolves. So yeah, it's just the way it is.
It is. It is. Well, I know folks can stay up to date with the latest weather forecast. Sign up for your weekly letter or newsletter and
Mhm.
more. ag-wx.com. That's ag-wx.com. Eric Snodgrass, Nutrient Ag Solutions. Always great to talk with you, my friend. Have a fantastic week, and we'll talk to you next week.
Sounds good. See ya.